Hello, Starseeds, and welcome to this episode of Psychedelic Neurolinguistic Astrology Chats. This is going to be the second installment. This is a little bit delayed as I was trying to time this particular chat with Louis Riel Day, or Family Day as it was known in Ontario, which was about over a week ago. And it was to kind of look at a little bit of a rebel hero in Canadian history. Louis Riel was actually born and grew up in the same part of Winnipeg that I was from, so St. Boniface. Louis Riel was Métis, and so I can relate to that, being half Filipino and half South African, because about him calling himself a half-breed, not really fitting into one group or another, and from that kind of creating this whole movement around that to have a free Manitoba. It kind of ended tragically. I will get into who Louis Riel was, his importance to the prairies and the Red River Rebellion, as well a birth and a death chart when it comes to an astrological Starseed Blueprint of Louis Riel, because it was really interesting in all of my research of looking at death charts that when it came to what was out there in terms of research, there was a lot of looking at your natal chart and as a way of determining time of death, which I found a little bit morbid. The time of birth is like the time we came into this existence, but there is significance to be had from the moment that we leave this existence. And so I'm taking this particular astrology conversation as an opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into the time of death chart, because Louis Riel was actually tried for treason and hung by the Canadian government in 1885, which was 100 years before I was born. Really crazy timing there, because there's a few quotes from Louis Riel that speak to the spirit of the land and kind of the struggles that we are still kind of going through today in terms of divisiveness between groups and things like that. And hopefully we can get some intel from the cosmos and the stars to get a better sense of where we stand going forward as Pluto is going into Aquarius. And today we actually have Mercury in Pisces, and Louis Riel had his moon in Pisces, and so that usually speaks to a type of psychic ability, a quality of being able to tap into the spiritual, mystical realms. And Louis Riel did have, they put him in an insane asylum, I think 10 years before he passed. There was because he apparently had some like fanatical beliefs about his people and things like that. So people attributed that to just being crazy, but he didn't get away with an insane plea. And it's because we don't do a very good job in our society, in my opinion, of really being able to have conversations about things that are not quite so tangible. And when we're talking about mystical experiences, when we're talking about spiritual experiences, we don't have enough NLP and language at our hands to, I think, effectively speak about it in a way that we can really communicate what that inner experience truly feels like. So we kind of like grasp towards things like religion and what's out there, but that may not necessarily convey what is really going on. And so with that, let's get into the presentation. Okay, everybody, welcome to the second installment of the Psychedelic Neurolinguistic Astrology Salon. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing Louis Riel, as I discussed in the intro, and the Starseed Blueprint, because this is going to be a great opportunity, a learning opportunity to further go into what the importance of a natal chart in the different storylines that are available to you, as well as the death chart and the importance of what that means for us who have that story of that life now left to us to take forward, right? Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the presentation. Welcome to Psychedelic Neurolinguistic Astrology, and storytelling is one of the better ways to communicate both the mystical and magical parts of our reality. And so on today's episode, we are going to be doing a Starseed Blueprint analysis on Louis Riel, the father of Manitoba and a freedom fighter from Canada's history. So who was Louis Riel? Louis Riel was known as the father of Manitoba. He was born in 1844 in St. Boniface, in the Red River settlement, which is now Winnipeg, in what was then known as Rupert's Land. Now, back in the day, Rupert's Land was mainly owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company made a deal with the Canadian government to turn over Rupert's Land to the Canadian government so that Manitoba would then become part of the Canadian Confederacy. And of course, there was no talk to the people, and so the people were very outraged that they weren't involved in these conversations. This sounds very familiar. And so Louis Riel led two resistance movements against the Canadian government and its first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. And so I'm going to get into the Red River Resistance because if we think of Star Wars and we think about the rebels, Louis Riel was kind of part of the leader of the rebels, let's say. And 100 years ago, Canada was still in its infancy and was still establishing governance over the once wild land. The Hudson's Bay Company signed over Rupert's Land to the Dominion of Canada without first consulting the people. And as such, there was a struggle for independence for the people, and this struggle still exists today. And I included a map here so you can see exactly where the Red River settlement is. That is now what is known as Winnipeg. And the Métis, and I should actually clarify what Métis is, or it's supposed to be half Aboriginal and half French descent. They say European descent, but it's mainly French speaking. There is quite a large French speaking community in Winnipeg. I actually took French from grade 1 up until grade 8. I know how to conjugate verbs very well, and it's kind of important to note that in the language, Louis Riel actually went and was formally trained in Montreal for school, and when he delivered his final speech, his final plea to the jury and judge at his final trial for treason, it was done so eloquently. And this is why there's no guilt. You couldn't do an insane plea in that kind of case. And so it's important to note that jury was entirely English speaking, and so it's highly likely that no one really understood what he was saying. So this struggle, of course, it does still exist today. I think that was enough of a history lesson into Canadians' great history and a couple of the wrongs of the Canadian government. And so let's move on into some magical astrology. And you can see to the side of me Louis Riel's natal chart. So his sun is located in Libra, but not just his sun, Mercury is also there, and also Mars, as well as his midheaven, which is represented by the MC that you can kind of see here. And Mars and Mercury are conjunct in the sign of Libra. The sun is also cusping Scorpio. That is whenever there's a cusp kind of location, there is this feeling of transiency, there we go, and just an awareness of liminal spaces. And that will amplify in the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, his moon is located in Pisces, and that typically gives these individuals very much a psychic, dreamlike quality. Pisces also rules both birth and death, and the space in between, the darkness before the dawn. And if we see here too, Louis Riel was someone who definitely put himself, his body into, like, he basically did a self-sacrificing thing when he went to war in terms of rebelling against the government on behalf of his people. And there's very much an expression of this in his chart in terms of him not being able to stand for injustice. All of that action in Libra shows that there is a strong aptitude towards being just and fair. And as a leader, very charismatic, very popular. The people rose Louis Riel up to be a leader. He was also a magnificent speaker. And you can see here that Mercury, the ruler of communication and thought and orating, being that in Libra, would make him a very Venetian speaking leader. If we think of people like JFK was a Libra rising. That expression in the sign of Libra gives off the impression of being able to speak for the collective in an informed way. And that's further emphasized by the moon being in Pisces. He also has Jupiter there, and Jupiter is known as expanding and making more of exemplifying, amplifying the sign that it's in. And so the moon being in Pisces as well as Jupiter being in Pisces, that's a lot of psychic energy. And I think just in the time, he went to study in Montreal to be a priest. He didn't end up becoming a priest. He ended up with having 3 children, I believe. But his training, he definitely, like, that idea of religion is ruled by Pisces as well. So that's very much shown and expressed in the chart. His Pluto, which we're always interested in Pluto and where Pluto's sitting, is also in a cusp location, and it is opposing his midheaven as well as his sun. So deep transformation when it comes to Pluto, and it's going to be that his life will be something that ends up transforming through his death. And it's kind of fitting that this will be the first death chart that I will be looking at for this type of conversation, because oftentimes when we look at astrology charts, there tends to be this predictive quality to it. This, like, oh, can I predict who my can I predict who my husband's going to be, or can I predict what next job I'm going to get, or can I predict when I'm going to die? So it was very interesting in looking for translations of time of death charts, that there wasn't really a lot out there. There was instead a lot of indicators in your natal chart to see, like, well, can I find out when I'm going to die? I'm like, ooh, that's very limiting. I think when you look at this beautiful natal chart, could we predict when Louis Riel was going to die based on this natal chart? Sure, I suppose. If you wanted to, knowing what we know about him now, you could kind of see some of the signs here where Pluto's sitting in a cusp location and opposing a lot of the more personal planets. Yeah, he's going to be a conduit for change, and Pluto does things in this way that is like deep and death and transformational, and Pluto represents death itself. So yeah, you could say that you could foresee that. If we look at the 12th house action here, there's not really any activity in it. And usually you would say that would be some sort of indicator as well, but perhaps it's because a lot of stuff is going on in Pisces. So in terms of the natal chart, that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of Louis Riel's natal chart. Let's now flip over to his death chart. Oh, and before we get into the death chart of Louis Riel, I wanted to drop this really interesting quotation by Louis Riel himself. Heretic or hero. When you look at the research and biography of Louis Riel, he's very much a controversial figure in Canada's history, and I find it very interesting that this government has decided to give Louis Riel the title of the Father of Manitoba because he wanted a free Manitoba, not one that was part of this government. But he did say that my people will sleep for 100 years, but when they awake, it will be the artists that give them their spirit back. I'll just leave that there. I thought it was a really interesting and epic quote. So now we can see to the side Louis Riel's death chart. The sun is in the final degrees of Scorpio, opposing both Pluto and Neptune. So interestingly enough, the final degree of Scorpio is also when JFK and C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley left this dimension. The moon is in Pisces, which is a very psychic position, as well as Louis Riel was actually born with the moon in Pisces. There's also a bit of a conjunction between the moon and the south node, which says to me that it's about fulfilling a purpose set out in a past life or something, accumulation of a story. I know that we have the head of the dragon and the tail of the dragon, but remember that this is now a death chart as opposed to a life chart. So the accumulation of this here in the first house is almost accumulation of a story. A beginning and an end. A beginning is just enough, comes from another ending situation. Let's see here. So in terms of other things to point out when it comes to death charts, a main thing here that I wanted to, I guess, express is that there wasn't a lot of information on casting specifically for a time of leaving the earth. As I mentioned in the introduction, I found a really touching story of a girl who lost her twin sister, and she derived a lot of comfort through casting her twin sister's time of death chart, because in the chaos and in the pain of a lot of the storylines we do end up playing out in this existence, there is an overall opera in the cosmos. Cosmos actually is the opposite of chaos. There's a grand order to what sometimes seems like disorder. And if we see here in the death chart for Louis, the sun is in Scorpio. As I said, like the final degrees of Scorpio, always this like very transformational change, because the wheel of the zodiac also represents the path of a soul through existence. And Scorpio, Libra is where it separates, and the scales, think of like Anubis and the scales wearing your heart against a feather. Then you go into the darkness, the underworld, to then emerge transformed. So the sun being here, it's like a point of change, a point of transmutation, changing over, and it is opposing Neptune in Taurus. So his body is going to be given up to the spirit realm, to the next stage, but his sun it's moving on from this storyline. So as I was mentioning before, in terms of the north and south nodes, we have an interpretation of both those nodes when it comes to a birth chart. But when it comes to a death chart, the way I would look at it is that it's almost like a bookend. It's the end of this story, and it closes where it began, where you came from the great all ether to live out this storyline and then leave into the next, and in doing so fulfill certain goals and experiences in this particular lifetime and storyline that are beneficial to the collective dream world of everyone and the reality of everyone in terms of living free and, you know, that rebel heart. So didn't want to have this death chart be dreary at all, but really more of an finding of peace with what death really is, which is a transitory point. And to quote Dr. Manhattan, end, there is no end. And so, as someone who similarly has an ancestry that is between two worlds, I can empathize with the greater connection between our peoples and this land that we find ourselves in. And the fact that we really need to start thinking of the Earth and our planet as a sentient being, because we are losing that connection if we simply take on the storylines that are given to us. And so I'll clarify. I first learned about Louis Riel. We actually had a school named Louis Riel that was not too far away from my school back in Winnipeg. But I remember learning about Louis Riel in social studies. Yeah, I think that was the class, social studies. Because the way it kind of played out made no sense to me. Because they're like, oh, he was tried as a traitor and he was hung, and then later on, but then he was like a hero, and he's the reason why Manitoba is even part of Canada. I'm like, how did that happen? Like, it just didn't really add up. And you can see that that's where we get that quote of those who tell the stories rule the world, because it's about how that story is told. I really don't think Louis Riel would be too happy about Manitoba actually being part of Canada as a whole, especially considering the way that the federal government treats provinces in the prairies and stuff like that. So something to think about in terms of a rebel heart, because I was born 100 years after Louis Riel was put to death. Interesting timing, and maybe I'm supposed to, or I have been feeling rather, that it's just about sharing stories. And from this perspective, I'm leveraging Louis Riel, who I learned about when I was in school, and I'm using Louis Riel's life and death as a learning tool for you to learn about birth and death charts as it comes to astrology. And perhaps you can think about asking or casting for a death chart or of someone that you love to derive peace from it. Because in the whole story lines of everyone and what we're going through and what we're figuring out, for us to realize that perhaps that person truly did, as I found out with Louis Riel, you lived out your storyline. And yes, it was a tragic ending, but that tragic ending was necessary for everything else to kind of unfold the way it did. So I will leave that there. And so finally, I'm going to leave this psychedelic neurolinguistic astrology conversation with this. For more magic, you can always contact us at sacredsomaalchemy.com. We are in the process of updating a lot of the stuff on the website so that it becomes crystal clear the pathways that you can reach out to us to get a ceremony or warrior class training or just some supplement guidance or NLP, any of that kind of stuff. So whatever it may be, my earthling friends, that will be updated in the next couple weeks or so. And until then, until this next conversation, I look forward to seeing all of you in the next one. And if you have any requests in terms of who you would like to see a psychedelic neurolinguistic astrology interpretation of, I am all ears. I had a friend of mine who suggested David Bowie and Iman, and I think I'm going to take that on actually before I do Bonnie and Clyde. So if you have any other, suggestions such as that, please let me know. So until then, Starseeds,